Well, hi there. I'm Adam Cook. Thank you for joining me for the latest edition of Telile 24/7. We've got a busy show this week. In just a few moments, I'll be sitting down with former Cape Breton-Richmond MLA and Provincial Cabinet Minister Michel Samson to talk about the recent resignation announcement by Premier Stephen McNeil. But we begin with coverage of a recent protest along the Canso Causeway that sought to draw attention to the issue of murdered and missing Indigenous women across Canada and here in the Maritimes. As fresh as some wounds were for some of the participants, they were also framed by the shadow of a young woman from an Aboriginal community here in Cape Breton Island that has gone missing just over the past week, drawing concern across the province for her whereabouts. Here's that report from the Causeway right now. The Canso Causeway celebrated the 65th anniversary of its official opening this past week on August the 13th. Now on August 13th, 1955, over 100 bagpipers made the trek across the causeway from Port Hastings to Ald's Cove to help celebrate the launch of the new link between Cape Breton Island and mainland Nova Scotia. However, there was a very different march across the causeway just a few nights ago on Sunday, August the 16th, to mark a very, very dark period in Canada's history. When the Canso Causeway celebrated its 50th anniversary in 2005, some Mi'kmaq leaders chose not to take part. They stated at the time that they didn't feel it was right to participate, given that Mi'kmaq leaders were not consulted about the construction of the link between mainland Nova Scotia and Cape Breton Island in the early 1950s. Efforts have been made to remedy this situation in recent years. In early 2019, the mayor of Port Hawkesbury, Brenda Chisholm-Beaton, launched a campaign to have Unamagi, which of course is the Mi'kmaq word for Cape Breton Island, included in the signage that welcomes people from mainland Nova Scotia to Cape Breton. And on Sunday evening, August the 16th, many Mi'kmaq and Mi'kmaq supporters took to the Canso Causeway to state their case for missing and murdered Indigenous women across Canada and here in the Maritimes.
Every day is a good day to do this because it's up to us to stand up for our nation of Indigenous people, not just the women, but the men and boys as well. So any day and every day would be a good day to stand up for justice.
These words from Annie Bernard Daisley, a band councillor from Wakaba First Nation, found a home in the hearts of an estimated 60 people from across Cape Breton's Indigenous communities that joined with her on the Port Hastings side of the Canso Causeway on Sunday evening. The protest march was designed to draw attention to the cases of murdered and missing Indigenous women across Canada. It's an issue that hits home for Bernard Daisley. Her cousin, Cassidy Bernard, was found dead in her home in October 2018. 14 months later, RCMP laid second-degree murder charges against Wagmacook resident Dwight Isidore, Bernard's ex-boyfriend, in connection with Bernard's death in Wakaba, which occurred in full view of the young woman's twin daughters, who at the time were 5 months old. However, on this Sunday evening, as they make their way from Port Hastings to Ald's Cove, flying yellow banners, burning sweetgrass, and singing traditional Indigenous songs, these protesters don't just have Cassidy Bernard in mind. This protest was sparked in part by the death of Chantel Moore, who was shot by RCMP during what was described as a wellness check in northern New Brunswick on June the 4th. Only 8 days later, another member of New Brunswick's Indigenous community, Rodney Levi, was shot by RCMP. The New Brunswick government has called for coroner's reports into the deaths of Moore and Levi, but in the meantime, a national call to action with regards to the death of Moore, originally from British Columbia and living temporarily in New Brunswick at the time of her death, had sparked local residents to get together on the Canso Causeway on the evening of August the 16th to draw attention to the growing concern about what is happening to Indigenous women across the country.
They had called for a national day from coast to coast to honor Chantel and to do a peaceful demonstration across the nation, and today was the day that they had picked. We've done so many different things for Cassidy, and we said as a family, as one big family unit, that we weren't going to stop, that we were going to keep continuing to fight for justice for our Indigenous men and women and our girls and boys, and our two-spirited as well.
Chantel Moore's spirit was especially felt during the tail end of the protest, when Moore's mother, Martha Martin, phoned Bernard Daisley's cell and delivered both thanks and encouragement to all those gathered around.
I know she felt a lot of support. She's just texted me, and she felt honored, and that we're standing up for her daughter and everyone else in this nation that's been missing. We're standing up for justice for Chantel, and that her death was wrong and it was murder, and the man is back to work. That's ridiculous. If he had killed a dog in that same manner, he killed Chantel, he'd still be off of work.
Sunday's protest came at a time of heightened concern for a young Mi'kmaq teenager who has gone missing from Cape Breton over the past week. 14-year-old Waikopa resident Molly Martin, also known as Mary Martin, was last seen in Eskasoni on the evening of Thursday, August the 13th. Subsequent reports have seen her in the company of a white male in his late 40s in the communities of Catalone and then Forshoe. Nova Scotia RCMP released an emergency alert regarding Martin's disappearance just after midnight on Thursday, August the 20th. However, RCMP have continually said that Martin does not meet the criteria required for an Amber Alert. Waikopa First Nations Chief Rod Gugu vehemently disagreed.
Mi'kmaq family allowed a non-native to take that child out of our community against our wishes, against the wishes of Chief and Council.
And despite the attendance of nearly 6 people from across Cape Breton Island at Sunday's protest on the Canso Causeway, Chief Gugu had another question he wanted answered. Mainly, why were there only about 6 men taking part?
Just because they're native children, nobody cares. Just because our women are native women, nobody cares. Well, we do, where I come from.
However, Annie Bernard Daisley, who sits with Chief Gugu on Waikopa First Nation Band Council, had an upbeat response to the concept of a low number of male participants in the Canso Causeway rally.
I guess everybody has a different opinion. I can understand his point, where really it's the women that stand up. The women are the matriarchs typically in our nation as Mi'kmaq, and even across this land the women are matriarchs. So it's not uncommon for having women to stand up for inequality and for the injustices that we face. It would have been nice to see more men, but however, in saying that, the women that were here are powerful and the men that were here were just as powerful. So, it is what it is.
The evening also proved powerful for Tricia Johnson of Eskasoni. Since 2001, she has been waging a battle to find out more information about the death of her sister Cheryl Ann Johnson. Cheryl Ann was just 23 when her body was found in Sydney. Police closed the case 2 days later. In 2017, Tricia Johnson testified before the National Inquiry on Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women when it came to Cape Breton Island. She says events like the Canso Causeway protest of August 16th give her the courage to keep up her fight.
They're all hidden close to home, like all these cases. Like I know Cassidy's mom, like we're good friends. Even Chantel Moore, like I couldn't believe, like why wouldn't you shoot her in the leg? Why shoot her so many times? Why? She was tiny, she's a woman. You don't need that kind of force against anyone. So I'd like to see a total ban on guns on any reservation, because I'm scared to talk to cops. I'm scared to, ask for help. It's too much that I have to be scared to ask for help.
While traffic was blocked on both ends of the Canso Causeway for the first hour of Sunday night's event, most motorists greeted the protesters with a chorus of car horns. However, Annie Bernard Daisley feels that a more profound impact would have been made if drivers had actually stopped and joined the protest.
It's easy to go by and honk your horns, but come on and stand with us. If you're sitting in your car for a couple hours, come and stand with us, It's not an inconvenience. It's not about inconvenience the public or anybody else would stop on the roads. It's about shining awareness and shining the light on the situation in this nation, because it is wrong. And it's sad as a nation that we still have to stand up on the road and promote and create awareness for what's happening in this country. It's just not fair. And you treat people with human decency. Canada isn't treating us with human decency, that's for sure.
However, as Mi'kmaq music filled the air, cars started flowing again through the Canso Causeway, and the last round of protesters greeted them with signs and flags in Ald's Cove. Organizers for the Canso Causeway protest rally were happy with the turnout and pleased with the impact they've made so far.
I know it was such short notice. I didn't know if I'd be standing here alone or if I'd be standing here with 20 or 30 or 100 people. I had no idea. To me, this was a perfect and everything. My philosophy is everything that happens is meant to be. Nobody stands alone. Nobody stands alone. Everybody stands together.
At the Canso Causeway for Telile 24/7, I'm Adam Cook. Politics in Nova Scotia got quite a shake-up earlier this month when Premier Stephen McNeil announced that he would step down from his post in the coming months. He'll stay on until the Liberal Party of Nova Scotia chooses a new leader. We don't know when exactly that will happen yet, but we do know that this is quite a change for leadership in Nova Scotia, since McNeil has been the Premier for nearly 7 years and he's been the leader of the Liberal Party for the past 13. So we decided on Telile 24/7 to check in with someone who has worked closely with McNeil during his own time in the Provincial Liberal Caucus. He served 19 years as the MLA for both Richmond and then Cape Breton-Richmond and served in several cabinet portfolios. He is Michel Samson. We caught up with him earlier this week. Here's that interview right now. And we're pleased to welcome for his first visit to Telile 24/7, a longtime MLA for Richmond, then Cape Breton-Richmond. He has served several cabinet portfolios in the cabinets of both Stephen McNeil and Russell McClellan. We're pleased to welcome Michel Samson to Telile 24/7. Thank you for giving us a couple of minutes today.
How are you, Adam?
Very good, very good. Glad to have you. How's yourself now?
I'm doing very well, and certainly congratulations on this new venture with Telile. I'm sure that Silver Dawn is looking down favorably at seeing that his creation of Telile is continuing in this new digital age with an even new version of that. So congratulations to you and to everyone at Telile for sponsoring this new venture.
Thank you very much. I shudder to even be mentioned in the same breath as Silver Donald, but a fella does his best and grows a little more silver to be done with it as well, too. So
we're all doing that.
Exactly. So you're here because we wanted to get your thoughts on the recent stepping down of Stephen McNeil as Premier of Nova Scotia. And of course, he'll stay on until a permanent leader is chosen. But I wanted to ask you to begin with, were you caught off guard? Were you surprised by the announcement? What was your immediate reaction when you heard the news just a couple of weeks ago?
Well, it was a sense of shock, which I think is what everyone in Nova Scotia had in not seeing it coming. But looking at the reasons that he provided afterwards, having served for 19 years, having the honor of representing the people of Richmond and then Cape Breton-Richmond, he's done it for 17 years. 7 of those was as Premier and even longer as leader of the party. So certainly I can appreciate the fact that he said he was tired and it was time for him to move on to something else. And we all know that the last 6 months has been extremely challenging all over the world, and certainly here in Nova Scotia on not only what COVID has done, but when one looks at some of the horrific events that took place, the largest mass murder in Canadian history, the loss of service people with the military helicopter crash, one of the snowbird pilots being killed, and the fact that Premier had to stand in front of Nova Scotians on a weekly basis in the face of such tragedy. And I think Nova Scotians really relied upon him for comfort and for guidance in such difficult times. I can't imagine the tremendous personal toll that would have had on him of having to be the face for the province, of reassuring Nova Scotians, making decisions in unprecedented conditions, and then having to deal with these tragedies on top of it. I can only imagine how difficult it was, and certainly appreciate and respect the fact that he made it clear that it was his intention to step down after presenting his 5th balanced budget in the spring. But because of COVID, I think it's just another sign of Stephen McNeil's personality, and that he wasn't prepared to leave province in such a difficult time and instead chose to stay on, not knowing how long this was going to take, and through some very difficult periods.
I'm curious, just to springboard off that, Michelle, the Premier has won back-to-back majority governments for the first time since John Buchanan did it back in the 80s, so he's had electoral success. But by the same token, there have been some corners of the province in which he hasn't been well liked, in which his public demeanor may have turned some people off. Do you get the sense, watching what's happened in the last few months, that Premier McNeil may have been able to rehabilitate his image a little bit with some of those corners where there may have been detractors? Do you feel like the leadership he's provided may have won a few people over that weren't necessarily with him in early 2020?
There's no question of that, Adam. I heard from a number of people who reached out to me to various means of communication. Some said, look, I didn't vote for him, but I now have a much better appreciation of who he is. And that's one of the challenges that you face in elected life, in that many Nova Scotians outside of your own riding make impressions based on what they see in the media, which often is going to be a very short clip, maybe one of the questions in question period, and that can make impressions on people. And I think Nova Scotians, some of them may have had a negative impression of the Premier in that they only saw one side. And I think because of the pandemic and the way the news conferences were structured, it allowed him to speak freely and allowed him to show that side. And I think during COVID especially, what I heard from people is that I think he struck the right balance, and that there were some days where he had to be angry and almost like the father figure of telling Nova Scotians, you have to follow these rules and you have to be responsible. And at the same time, I think he showed that balance of when things were going well, and especially during the tragedies that we faced, of showing that compassionate side and giving Nova Scotians the moral boost that I think we all needed during the time. So absolutely, I certainly think that he gets to leave with Nova Scotians having seen the side of him that we've all seen, who've worked with him so closely, that we knew was there, but that wasn't always being shown through the media. I think the pandemic certainly showed that side of him.
Well, let's wind the clock back a little bit on your first impressions of him. Going back 17 years, he was first elected in Annapolis in 2003. We knew he had some roots here in Richmond County as well during that time. What did you think of him when he first came on deck as an MLA, and then as things started to shift towards him running for the Liberal leadership in 2007?
Well, I think what a lot of people might not realize is that the Premier ran in the general election of 1999 in Annapolis and was unsuccessful. That's when John Hamm defeated the McClellan government and formed a majority government. And so after not having electoral success, he continued to work hard in his riding. And in 2003, he was successful, even though it was a minority Conservative government that was elected. He was elected in Annapolis and hasn't looked back since. And you're right, I was elected first in 98, so I was already at that point, in political terms, a veteran, having survived 3 elections. And so I did get to see him grow as a person, grow in his confidence. And by the time he did become leader, and we would watch him give speeches and everything else, many times with no notes in front of him, and able to speak. And when he became Premier, and I would go to Chamber of Commerce events or others, everyone would remark at how confident he spoke, that he spoke from the heart, didn't need notes in front of him, didn't need a teleprompter, and knew how to speak to the crowd that he was in front of. So there's no question that he certainly matured in many ways during his time, from when he was first elected to when he became leader to when he became Premier. But there's no question, you would be hard-pressed to have heard a speech from the Premier without him mentioning his mother Teresa, without him mentioning Lardwez, Lower Lardwez to be specific, and the roots in Richmond County and his roots in Cape Breton. He was very proud of it. He was certainly very proud of his mom. I think a lot of people know the family story and the tragedy that they faced, and from a very large family. And I think he always maintained those roots. And even when he had some very difficult decisions to make, it was always on the basis that it was the right decision for the province.
I wanted to ask you, and it may not be a fair comparison, but I'll ask you anyway. You worked very briefly in the cabinet of Russell McClellan during that minority situation in the late 90s. It came just after you won your first election as an MLA in Richmond County. How does Russell McClellan compare to Premier McNeil, to Stephen McNeil, in the way that they operated not only the government, but as well the way they operated just working with caucus?
I think it was such a different time. When I look back at going into cabinet in 1998, it was a minority government. We had just lost half of our seats in the 98 election. We were tied with the NDP for seats. We each had 19 and the Conservatives had 10. You were living day to day as a government. It was almost impossible to do any long-term planning. It was a matter of how are we going to get a throne speech passed? How are we going to get a budget passed? That was a priority of the day, and that was the focus. It was impossible to do long-term planning. Whereas with Premier McNeil, after the 2013 election, it was a significant majority. We knew that we had 3 to 4 years to be able to do long-term planning and have a vision set for the province. So I think because the circumstances were so different, it's very hard to explain the difference in approach. But just like all human beings, everyone brings a different approach to governance. And Russell McClellan had his own approach, and certainly Stephen McNeil brought his own approach to it as well. What was very clear with Premier McNeil is that we had to stick to our plan. And having been elected for 19 years, I've watched Liberal governments, Conservative governments, NDP government, and we wanted to learn from some of the mistakes that had been made in the past, and the fact that we had to bring fiscal balance to the province, and to do so was going to take some very difficult decisions, and we had to stick to them. And that's one thing he certainly made sure of, is that we did stick to them. And fortunately, the Premier had a loyalty in the caucus and in the cabinet that everyone stuck together. And having watched other governments in the past, Adam, I've seen cracks appear publicly, privately, and governments having to back down because they couldn't sustain the pressure that they were facing. That's one thing that no one will ever suggest from Premier McNeil, is that he backed down in the face of pressure. But at the same time, I think it speaks volumes of his leadership that with the men and women that served with him remained committed to him right to the very end.
I want to pick up on the concept of loyalty, because he put great stock in your particular position within the Liberal caucus. And then when he started forming his cabinet in 2013, he gave you several important portfolios, economic and rural development, energy at one point, tourism as well. I remember covering an event in my former life as a reporter from the Reporter newspaper, and you and he were speaking, and he made the joke that shortly after being elected, he turned to you and he made you the House leader and said, "Are you sure you got all this?" And you said, "Oh yeah, I've got everything." And he said, "Good, you call me when you need me," and just kind of walked away with a laugh. But I wonder if it is at all possible for you to put into words the kind of relationship you had with him in terms of how much loyalty he put into you as a member of his team.
And I think it's a loyalty that went both ways, and that he knew that I had his back and that I would do whatever I could to support the government and support our agenda. And House Leader is a critical role of getting the legislative agenda of the government passed through the legislature. And I knew how much pressure he was under. As much as my responsibilities were as minister, he was the Premier. He had that much more. And I took it as a badge of honor when he could look at me and say, "I'm going back to the office. I know you've got everything under control here, and as you said, and as he said, call me when you need me." And that, I thought that was my job, because as Premier, while it's important that he's in the legislature for question period to be accountable and everything else, he's got to govern the province, and you can't really do that sitting on the floor of the legislature. You have to be in your office, getting in briefings, making decisions, and doing planning. And so we had some late night sessions, to say the least, during our time. But my goal was to make sure that he could leave the legislature and know that everything was under control, and that I, along with the cabinet and all of our colleagues, were going to remain committed to getting our legislative agenda through.
I want to speak to you a little bit about what you see going forward for the party. And you knew that I was going to ask this question at some point, so I'm going to ask it now. Have you given any consideration to running for the Liberal leadership now that McNeil has stepped down?
Well, look, I think it was a shock to everyone. So nobody was ever thinking of this. We were all under the belief that the Premier was going to seek a third term. I firmly believe he would have won another majority government, and I think most people would agree. He's walking out with the party at historic numbers. And in fact, Adam, right from 2013, the polling numbers for the Premier and Liberal Party are unprecedented, in that no government in Nova Scotia has ever seen that type of sustained popularity during their mandate. In fact, most governments, within 3 months after election, their poll numbers started to go down and would stay down. But the Premier continued to do that. And I think it's because of his style of governing attracted a lot of people, much more than just traditional Liberals. And that I know a lot of people who have historically supported the Progressive Conservative Party who said, we voted for Premier McNeil. We like what he's doing. I had one colleague tell me when he was asked to give money and help out in the 2017 campaign, he said, why would I want to defeat a Premier who's governing the way that I'd want to see the province governed? And I think that's why he's had the electoral successes, because he's attracted much more than just Liberal voters. He's attracted voters from both the Progressive Conservatives and from the NDP, which has allowed him to, as you mentioned, win back-to-back majorities, which hadn't been done since the 1980s. So I think it bodes well for the party going forward. I've been approached by a number of people asking me to consider it, which is always very humbling. And sometimes you hear from people that just you never expected to hear from. But I think it's still early days. My focus, when asked, has been on the Premier's legacy, what he was able to do for our province during his time, and I think history will reflect on his tenure very positively. In that, unlike almost all other Canadian provinces, he was able to bring in 4 balanced budget. The one brought in the spring this year would have been the 5th. Unfortunately, a pandemic is going to have a significant impact on that. But he was able to do that while at the same time, one of the first things that he did was call for a full inquiry in the Home for Coloured Children, which led to a public apology. And I have to tell you, I know for the Premier personally, that was one of the more touching moments for him, was to be able to deliver that apology and to send a message to the African Nova Scotian community that what was done to them was not right. And it needed to be recognized, and I know that was very important for him. But when you also look at the investments that were made in education, the new pre-primary program, which will addresses some of the concerns we heard from teachers that kids were just not ready socially or in their development when they were arriving in school for grade primary. Now they'll have a full year prior to that to be able to prepare, and significant cost savings for parents in childcare costs as well. I think he'll be remembered for that, and remembered for making the tough decisions that needed to be made for our province, and they weren't the easiest ones. But when wages and labor are 60% of your budget, you need to keep that under control, or you have no hopes of being able to balance the budget. And as the Premier said, none of us took any pleasure in having to make those tough decisions. And I think human nature is such that no one likes to say no to people. We like to be able to solve their problems and be able to make sure that people are happy and pleased with decisions that are made. And so it was an extremely difficult time. But the results speak for themselves, in that the Nova Scotia is rivaled in the economic success that it has had, while at the same time, the Premier put an end to the days of the large corporate handouts to companies. And I think he also showed an example in the fact that the members of the Legislative Assembly have not seen any change in their compensation since 2013, 7 years. And he made it clear that if we're going to ask for restraint, we have to show and lead by example. And he showed that. And I know many people think there has been increases, but I can assure you there hasn't. And he wanted to send that clear message, is that if people are going to feel some economic pain, the same has to be said for the elected officials.
You've touched on a number of things that a lot of people will connect to Stephen McNeil, both personally and professionally and politically as well, too. And I want to wrap this up by asking you if you feel that there were any defining moments for him, something that really stood out for you. I mean, we've talked about his approach to the pandemic. Some will suggest he will be remembered for the 4 words, "Stay the blazes home." And, you've also spoken to some of the tougher decisions that have been made over the course of the government. But is there any 1 or 2 things that really stand out for you where you look and say, yes, that was Stephen McNeil in a nutshell?
Well, look, and I think the way we've seen him perform with Dr. Strang during COVID, there's no question that everything he's done before that will be remembered, but his defining moment was the leadership that he showed during a pandemic. Adam, we were all scared. Many are still scared. This is an unprecedented incident in the history of our province, in the history of the world, and it's not one of those where you can take out a playbook and say, okay, let's see how they handled this the last time, and we'll make our decisions around that. Decisions are having to be made on the fly, having to be made on a day-to-day, hourly basis, and it's extremely difficult. But when you look at where Nova Scotia is and where Atlantic Canada is compared to the rest of the world, we're the envy. I have friends who live in the States and other provinces saying, how can we get to Nova Scotia? Because we feel we'd be safer in Nova Scotia than where we're at. That speaks volumes, and it took some very tough decisions, some that many people were questioning. We are getting ready to have schools reopen. We all understand, and as a parent, we're all a bit scared of how it's all going to work. But I think a lot of people take comfort in the fact that everything the Premier has done throughout this has been well thought out. It's been based on the science provided by Dr. Strang and other healthcare professionals, and it's been in the best interest of Nova Scotians. And God willing, we're going to be able to maintain control over this pandemic going forward, that we are going to have a successful reopening of schools and a safe environment for teachers, students, and all the staff and parents, and that we're going to continue on this path. But I think there's no question that when people will look back, they will look to what they saw from Premier McNeil during this crisis, because the fact that people could watch an entire news conference on national news rather than a 10-second clip on the 6 o'clock news, they got to see him speak freely. And he wasn't given, unlike question period where you're given 45 seconds to give an answer, he could speak several minutes, and he could show that human side to him. People got to see some humor, but they also got to see the father figure of chastising Nova Scotians when they had to be chastised, and telling them, we're in this together and you all have to be part of the solution. So I have no doubt that when Nova Scotians will look back, that will be where they will say, we saw the real Stephen McNeil. And I think those who've seen that side will say, finally, everyone else got to see what we knew all along. And for those who never saw it, it will be, we had no idea that is who Stephen McNeil was. And it's only during that period that we got to see the human side, the funny side, the compassionate side, the caring side that we knew all along was always there, and I think is reflective in the way that he governed our province.
And that's a good place to wrap this all up. Michel Samson, we thank you for giving us some time and some thoughts here today. Thanks so much for joining us on Telile 24/7.
Well, thanks so much, Adam. And I can tell you I've done, I think, 1 or 2 interviews since the last provincial election. So my respect for you and for your reporting and your fairness in Richmond and the Strait area is the reason why I agreed to do this, for the personal friendship that you and I have developed, but certainly the respect that I have for the work that you do and for this new venture. So not many other media outlets have managed to convince me to do interviews, but I was happy to be able to have this time to chat with you.
Well, we're happy to have you here and look forward to being able to catch up with you again sometime down the road.
All the best, Adam.
All right, you too. Michel Samson is a lawyer now practicing at the Halifax firm of Cox and Palmer. He is also a former MLA for Richmond and Cape Breton-Richmond and served several portfolios in the Stephen McNeil government. Stay tuned for more Telile 24/7 in just a moment. Join us next week on Telile 24/7 when we speak to current Cape Breton-Richmond MLA Alana Pond. She'll address the departure of Stephen McNeil and also comment on some other activities that are going on in the riding. And we'll also have an interview with Provincial PC Party leader Tim Houston and the new PC candidate for Richmond, Trevor Boudreau. And that wraps up this week's edition of Telile 24/7. Of course, this is your show, so I'd like you to tell me what stories, interviews, and features you'd like to see on Telile 24/7, or to leave some comments about what we've already done so far. You can reach me in a couple of different ways. I'm available by phone at 902-625-8863. You can also email me. That address is adamjrcook@gmail.com. Or you can contact Telile directly. The station phone number is 902-226-1928. Don't forget to follow Telile Community Television on social media. We're on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And on Telile's YouTube channel, you can see every single episode of Telile 24/7, including this one. And you can also check out individual stories and interviews from the show and all kinds of new material that my friends and I at Telile have been working on for the past few months. For now, I'm Adam Cook. Thank you for tuning in once again to Telile 24/7. I look forward to seeing you next week right here on Telile 24/7.